Hi everyone, so this video is going to be going over our functional groups and kind of just characterizing them a little bit to give us a clearer picture of what they are and allow us to study for the upcoming practical and exam. So functional groups, they are defined as specific groups of atoms within, so inside. So functional groups are specific groups of atoms that are inside of molecules that determine their chemical properties. And functional groups can also be called chemical groups, and when we're referring to amino acid side chains, they can be called R groups. And the functional group that is attached to a molecule is going to determine its function. The functional group is going to tell that molecule how reactive, how soluble, and the kinds of interactions and behavior that it's going to have. And I personally like to think of our functional groups like the personality traits of molecules. So these functional groups, they make our molecules unique and they give them their specific properties. So the first functional group that we're going to talk about is our hydroxyl group. And our hydroxyl group consists of an oxygen that is bonded to a hydrogen atom, which is what we see here in ethanol. And this group, it's often referred to as alcohols. And it's important that we clarify that when we're talking about an alcohol, what we're referring to is a compound that contains one or more hydroxyl groups attached to a saturated carbon. So an alcohol is referring to compounds with one or more hydroxyl groups attached to saturated carbons. And a saturated carbon is just one that is bonded to other atoms through single bonds. So ethanol, we have a carbon and it's bonded to this hydrogen through a single bond. It's bonded to this hydroxyl group through a single bond. It's even bonded to this other carbon through a single bond. So when we're talking about hydroxyl groups, we call them alcohols, but they are not actually an alcohol until it's bonded, it's attached to a carbon atom that makes a compound. So to satisfy any curiosities or maybe even clear up any confusion, yes, any molecule that has a hydroxyl group attached to carbon is an alcohol. So that even makes a molecule like glucose an alcohol. And we always talk about glucose as a sugar. We never really talk about the fact that it's an alcohol as well. But it is because it has one or more hydroxyl groups attached to a carbon or to its carbon skeleton. Glucose actually has 5 hydroxyl groups, which makes it considered a polyol. And polyol is just meaning that it has one or more hydroxyl groups. So a polyol is equal to a compound with one or more hydroxyl groups. So by that definition, ethanol is not a polyol because it only has one hydroxyl group. Another place that we find our hydroxyl groups in is carbohydrates. And something really, really important about our hydroxyl groups is that they make our molecules polar and hydrophilic. So this characteristic that they have, their polarity and their hydrophilicity, it is a key property of hydroxyl groups that we need to know. And because they are polar and because they are hydrophilic, they're going to increase water solubility because of their participation in hydrogen bonding. So we know that our hydroxyl groups, they contain an oxygen and they contain a hydrogen. And our oxygen is a lot more electronegative than our hydrogen atom. So this oxygen, this really electronegative oxygen, it's going to attract electrons to itself, and it's going to create an unequal sharing of electrons, which is going to create our partial positive and partial negative charges. And in this case, because our oxygen is the more electronegative atom, it is going to have a partially negative charge. Meanwhile, our hydrogen is going to have a partial positive charge. So water molecules, they're also able to form hydrogen bonds, and they're also polar. And what happens when we have a water molecule like this, when it's around a hydroxyl group, the hydroxyl group and the water molecule, they can bond in two different ways. We can either have our more electronegative hydroxyl oxygen bond to our less electronegative water molecules hydrogen, or we can have a less electronegative hydrogen atom on our hydroxyl group bond to our more electronegative oxygen in our water group. So I want you guys to understand that when an atom or a molecule, when it has the ability to form hydrogen bonds with water, that is when it is considered hydrophilic. It is considered hydrophilic because this bonding of hydrogen bonds, it's going to make it dissolve easily in water. So the next functional group that we're going to talk about is our carbonyl group. And the carbonyl group consists of a carbon that is double bonded to oxygen. And this is an extremely important functional group in organic chemistry. And there are two types of carbonyl compounds. We have our ketones, and our ketones, they are found within a carbon chain. They are not at the end. Our ketones are within. They are inside of our carbon chains, which is what we're seeing with propanone. We see a 3-carbon skeleton, 1, 2, 3, and in the middle carbon, we have it double bonded to an oxygen atom. Therefore, propanone is a ketone. And on the other hand, we have aldehydes, and aldehydes, they are found at the end of a carbon chain. So here we have, again, a 3-carbon skeleton, and at the very end of this molecule, we have the carbon double bonded to its oxygen, and this molecule is known as propanol. So this is our aldehyde. So the carbonyl group has a lot of key properties. It's also polar, and it's polar because there's a difference in the electronegativity between the carbon and the oxygen atoms. Our oxygen, it is more electronegative, which means it's pulling those electrons closer to itself. It has more electron density, and because it's more electronegative, it has a partial negative charge. Meanwhile, the carbon is going to have a partially positive charge. And this polarity is what's going to allow our carbonyl containing compounds to interact with other polar molecules, and it makes them reactive in a lot of chemical reactions. So, like our hydroxyl group, our carbonyl group is polar and hydrophilic, which means that it increases the solubility of that molecule inside of water. So our carbonyl group, our carbonyl carbon, it is electron deficient. It has less electron density than our oxygen, and that is actually called electrophilic. When something is electron deficient, it is electrophilic. So this electrophilic carbonyl carbon, that makes the carbonyl carbon susceptible to be attacked by nucleophiles, which are electron-rich species. And that's why our carbonyl compounds, they're going to oftenly participate in the addition or substitution reactions, and that's what's going to make it reactive. So let me just put this definition here. Nucleophiles are electron-rich. And our nucleophiles, they're going to attack our electrophiles. And that's going to increase their reactivity inside of chemical reactions. So the next group that we're going to talk about is our carboxyl group. And the carboxyl group is a functional group that consists of a carbonyl group, right? So our carbon double bonded to oxygen, that is our carbonyl group, and that carbonyl group is going to be attached to a hydroxyl group. And we represent the carboxyl group as COOH. And this is also a really important functional group in organic chemistry, especially in acids. So key properties of our carboxyl group is that they're also polar. They're polar because there is a difference in their electronegativity. The carbonyl oxygen is more electronegative than the hydroxyl oxygen. That oxygen is going to pull electrons towards itself. It's going to become more electron dense, and it's going to create partial negative charges on the oxygen and a partial positive charge on the carbon. And that is going to make carboxyl groups really reactive inside of chemical reactions. So they are polar, and they are also hydrophilic, which means that it is going to increase the solubility of that molecule in water. And they are also reactive, but another really important property of our carboxyl group is that it is acidic. Carboxyl group's acidity is one of the defining features of that group. And what happens is that the hydrogen atom, this hydrogen atom that is attached to the hydroxyl group, it is weakly acidic, and that means that it can be lost. And when we lose a hydrogen atom, it is called a proton, only when we're talking about our carboxyl group. So basically, because it's weakly acidic, it's going to be lost as a proton, and that's going to leave behind a negatively charged ion. And that is when we have COO minus, a negatively charged carboxylate ion. That is what that is. It is the loss of hydroxyl hydrogen. And it's really important that you guys understand that in the context of the carboxyl group and its acidic properties, the hydrogen atom is referred to as a proton. Specifically, the hydrogen atom that we find in the hydroxyl group that is attached to the carbonyl group, which creates the carboxyl group. And when a carboxyl group loses that hydrogen atom, the resulting species is that carboxylate ion. And this is going to occur because we have a negative charge on a carboxylate ion, and it's going to be stabilized by something called resonance. But that is beyond the scope of this class. So something important about our carboxyl groups is that they play a very important role in peptide bond formation. And basically, peptide bond formation, it's extremely essential in protein synthesis. And the formation of these peptide bonds, it's going to occur between the carboxyl group of one amino acid and the amino group of another amino acid. So our carboxyl group, it aids in protein synthesis. Now, the other group that we're going to talk about is called the amino group, and it is consisting of a nitrogen that is bonded to two hydrogen atoms. And our amino group is really basic, and that means that it is going to accept protons. And we already said that when we're talking about protons in these scenarios, they're actually our hydrogen atoms. So the nitrogen that we have in the amino group, it's going to have a lone pair of electrons, which makes it a nucleophilic site. That means that it can easily accept our hydrogen atoms, which are our protons. And that ability to accept those protons, that is what gives the amino group its basic properties. So in water, the amino group accepts or can accept protons, which are our hydrogen atoms, and then it can form an ammonium ion. So it accepts these hydrogen atoms to form an ammonium ion. And because our amino groups, because they have an electronegativity difference between our nitrogen and hydrogen, that amino group is also polar, and then it's going to also be hydrophilic, which is going to increase the solubility of this group in water. So another group that we're going to talk about is our phosphate group. And the phosphate group consists of a phosphorus atom that is bonded to 4 oxygen atoms. And these typically form a tetrahedral shape. Normally form tetrahedral shapes. And our phosphate group, it's actually negatively charged because we have 3 oxygen atoms that carry negative charges. And the key properties of our phosphate group is that they are extremely polar and that they carry negative charges. And because of this polarity, because of their charges, it's going to be really hydrophilic as well. And the negative charge on this phosphate group, it can participate in things like electrostatic interactions. And these electrostatic interactions, they're going to make our phosphate groups extremely essential in cellular processes. Our phosphate groups, they are also very reactive. Our phosphate groups, they can easily undergo hydrolysis, and that hydrolysis, that process, it's going to break the bonds that we have in our phosphate groups to release energy, which is really important to our energy metabolism. So our phosphate group, they are central to energy transfer, especially in molecules like ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And adenosine triphosphate, it contains 3 phosphate groups, and we have energy stored in these really high energy bonds. So these really high energy phosphoanhydride bonds that are found between our phosphate groups, and that energy, it's going to be released through hydrolysis, which is going to release energy. So basically, when ATP is hydrolyzed, energy is released, and that energy is going to be used by cells to power so many different kinds of biochemical processes like protein synthesis, muscle contraction, active transport, and all sorts of biochemical processes. And this ability of to be able to quickly add or remove our phosphate groups, it's essential for enzyme regulation and signaling pathways. And these concepts, they're just going to further emphasize the fact that our phosphate groups have a very, very important role in cellular function and energy metabolism. So the last group that we're going to talk about is our sulfhydryl group. It is also known as a thiol, and it is just consisting of a sulfur that is bonded to hydrogen. And our sulfhydryl group, it is really structurally similar to our hydroxyl group, but instead of an oxygen, we have a sulfur. So our sulfhydryl group, it is really polar, and so basically our sulfur atom, it is less electronegative than oxygen, which makes the sulfhydryl group less polar in comparison to hydroxyl groups. But our sulfur atom, it is still going to have a partially negative charge, and the hydrogen atom that is bonded to it is going to still be partially positively charged. And that is because of the difference in electronegativity. Our sulfur is more electronegative than our hydrogen, so it's pulling electrons closer to it. It is more electron dense. So its polarity is going to allow for some interactions with other molecules. And something else that is really important about our sulfhydryl group is that it has the ability to form disulfide bonds. So the sulfhydryl group, it is very reactive. And it's because the sulfur atom, it has this ability to form disulfide bonds, which actually it would be like this. This is a disulfide bond. And it can form these disulfide bonds with other sulfhydryl groups. And these reactions, this forming of this disulfide bond, it is extremely important in the stabilization of our three-dimensional structure of proteins. It is very important to protein folding. So we could say that a key role of our sulfhydryl groups is in the formation of these disulfide bridges, and it actually occurs between residues that we find inside of proteins, and the covalent bonds that it forms, it's crucial for that maintenance of that tertiary and quaternary structure of proteins, and it stabilizes their folding shapes. So we need to remember that our sulfhydryl groups are extremely important to maintaining protein structure. And this is because of their ability to form these disulfide bonds between sulfhydryl groups.